15 menu cards, preserved for decades in royal archives, tell a story that no biography ever fully captured. What Queen Elizabeth II actually chose to eat when she believed no one outside the palace kitchens was watching. These are not casual scraps of paper. Each card passed through a rigid chain of approval, reviewed by royal chefs, checked by household stewards, and in many cases quietly adjusted to fit protocols that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with position. To understand why a monarch's dinner selections required this level of institutional oversight is to understand something larger about how the British monarchy actually functions behind its ceremonial surface. At Buckingham Palace, food was never simply food. It was a mechanism of control, a daily demonstration of hierarchy, and in some cases, a matter of state security. The master of the household held authority over what appeared on any royal table, and beneath him, a structured kitchen staff operated under rules so specific that a single ingredient could not be introduced without clearance. This was the world in which Elizabeth's preferences existed, shaped as much by duty as by appetite. Public understanding of royal dining has always leaned towards spectacle: the state banquets, the ornate table settings, the photographs of foreign dignitaries raising crystal glasses beneath chandeliers. But those events represent only the visible layer. The 15 menu cards at the center of this account reveal something closer to the truth: a private pattern of eating that stayed remarkably consistent across 7 decades, regardless of who sat across the table or which nation's flag hung outside the window. The first card, dated from an early state visit in the 1950s, shows a request that seems almost modest by royal standards: a plain grilled sole with minimal seasoning. Palace chefs at the time understood this was not a matter of frugality. It reflected a broader institutional principle that has governed royal dining since the Victorian era: the sovereign's meal must never distract from the sovereign's presence. Elaborate flavors, heavy sauces, and unfamiliar textures were avoided, not because the kitchen lacked skill, but because protocol demanded predictability above all else. This principle explains why Elizabeth's meals rarely changed even as culinary trends transformed the rest of Britain. While the country embraced continental cuisine through the 1960s and 70s, the Queen's table remained anchored to simplicity. Roasted meats, steamed vegetables, minimal spice. Each choice was reviewed not for flavor alone, but for what it communicated about restraint, discipline, and the appearance of a monarch who did not indulge. Enforcement of these dining standards fell to a strict internal hierarchy. The royal household's culinary division answered directly to the master of the household, who in turn reported through channels that ultimately reached the private secretary's office. Deviations from approved menus were not simply frowned upon. They were documented, and in some recorded instances, chefs were quietly reassigned when their creative ambitions clashed with the institution's expectations of consistency. One card, prepared for a private family dinner rather than a state occasion, shows a request for a simple dessert, a light sponge with minimal decoration. On the surface, this appears to reflect nothing more than personal taste. Yet former household staff have noted that even private meals were shaped by unspoken rules about excess. A monarch who indulged too visibly, even behind closed doors, risked undermining the image of restraint that had defined the institution since the post-war years. Every dessert, every side dish, every small deviation carried institutional weight far beyond the plate. As the collection of menu cards moves chronologically forward, a pattern begins to emerge that reveals something deeper than personal preference. Elizabeth's meals grew more standardized, not less, as her reign progressed. Where a younger monarch might have experimented, the older queen adhered ever more closely to a small, repeated set of dishes. Palace insiders have suggested this reflected not diminishing curiosity, but an increasing awareness of her symbolic role. Every meal was, in effect, a message about stability sent to a nation that expected the crown to remain unchanged even as decades of political and cultural upheaval unfolded around it. This is where the deeper institutional logic becomes clear. The rules governing royal dining were never truly about food. They were about the monarchy's need to project continuity, discipline, and control. Values that could not be compromised even at something as private as a dinner table. The 15 menu cards, when placed side by side, form a quiet record of an institution enforcing its own image through the smallest details imaginable. What emerges next, as these cards are examined further, is a hierarchy of dining rules that escalates in seriousness, moving from simple ceremonial expectations toward decisions that touch the very structure of royal authority itself. The early cards reveal social customs enforced through subtle correction. But as the story progresses, the stakes embedded within these seemingly ordinary documents grow considerably higher, exposing a system where even a monarch's personal appetite existed under the quiet, constant supervision of the institution she led. The sixth card in the collection, dated from a diplomatic dinner in the early 1970s, introduces a different category of rule entirely, one that moved beyond simple ceremonial restraint into the realm of reputation management. This particular menu, prepared for a visiting head of state, shows a request for a dish substitution that seems trivial at first glance, a change from a cream-based sauce to a lighter vinaigrette. Yet household records from the period reveal that this substitution was not a matter of preference. It followed a directive from the Foreign Office, which had flagged concerns about how a rich, indulgent meal might appear in photographs during a period of domestic austerity measures across Britain. This is where the institutional weight of royal dining begins to shift. No longer were the rules simply about maintaining a consistent personal image. They now intersected directly with matters of national perception, economic messaging, and diplomatic sensitivity. A monarch's plate had become, in effect, an instrument of statecraft. Enforcement of these decisions did not rest with palace chefs alone. It required coordination between the master of the household, government communications officers, and in some documented cases, the Prime Minister's own office, which occasionally weighed in on how state dinners might be perceived by a watching public. The seventh and eighth cards, both connected to visits during periods of economic difficulty in Britain, reflect this same pressure. Portions grew visibly smaller. Courses were reduced from 5 to 3. Descriptions on the cards themselves became plainer, stripped of the ornate French culinary terminology that had once been standard practice. This was not accidental simplification. Palace communications staff understood that any leaked account of an opulent royal banquet during a time of public hardship could inflict lasting reputational damage, not just on the sovereign, but on the institution as a whole. A single indulgent dinner, if exposed, had the potential to undercut years of carefully cultivated public trust. What makes this tier of rules distinct from the earlier ceremonial ones is the nature of the consequence. Breaking a ceremonial rule might result in private correction, a quiet word from a senior steward, an internal note filed away. But breaking these mid-tier rules carried the risk of public embarrassment, a currency far more valuable to the monarchy than any individual meal. Reputation, once damaged, could not be easily restored through internal channels. It required public relations management, careful media handling, and sometimes years of rebuilding trust through unrelated gestures of humility and service. The ninth card offers a striking example of privilege intersecting with restraint. Prepared for a private luncheon with visiting royalty from a smaller European monarchy, the menu shows an intentional downgrade from a menu prepared only weeks earlier for a state visit from a larger, more powerful nation. This was not oversight. It reflected an unspoken but rigorously enforced principle within royal protocol that the scale and grandeur of hospitality must correspond precisely to the diplomatic weight of the guest. To serve an equally lavish meal to a minor royal house as one reserved for a major world power would have been read internally as a breach of diplomatic proportion, a subtle miscalculation that could unsettle carefully balanced international relationships. This hierarchy of hospitality reveals something important about how privilege operated within the palace walls. Access to the most elaborate meals was never simply a matter of status within the royal family itself. It was calibrated according to a much broader calculus of geopolitical importance, historical alliance, and diplomatic necessity. Even Elizabeth, as the presiding monarch, did not have unilateral authority to override these calculations on personal whim. The system existed above her preferences, guided by advisors whose entire function was to protect the institution from missteps that might ripple far beyond the dining room. The 10th card, perhaps the most revealing of this middle tier, documents an instance where a specific dish was removed from consideration entirely following an internal review. The dish itself was unremarkable, a traditional game course common to British aristocratic dining. But its removal followed concerns raised by household staff that its inclusion might draw unfavourable comparisons to a controversial hunting practice then under public scrutiny. The willingness to alter a menu based on shifting public sentiment demonstrates how deeply attuned the institution had become to controlling not just the monarchy's actions, but the perception of those actions, down to the smallest culinary detail. By this point in the collection, a clear pattern has taken shape. The early cards revealed rules rooted in ceremonial consistency, enforced through quiet correction and institutional habit. But these middle-tier cards expose something more consequential, a system where privilege, diplomacy, and public reputation intertwined at the dinner table, monitored and adjusted with the same seriousness once reserved for matters of state. The stakes, in other words, had risen considerably. What remains ahead in this examination moves into territory that touches the very structure of monarchical authority itself, where menu decisions intersect not merely with reputation, but with the internal mechanisms that determine how power is exercised, restrained, and preserved within the institution. The final tier of these 15 cards carries implications that extend well beyond the dining room, revealing rules whose violation would have threatened not embarrassment alone, but the deeper architecture of royal control. The 11th card in the collection carries a different weight entirely, one that moves beyond diplomacy and reputation into the deeper mechanics of institutional control. Dated from a period when Elizabeth's health had begun quietly declining in her later years, the menu shows a modification made not by her own request, but by directive from her medical team, communicated through the private secretary's office rather than the kitchen staff directly. This detail matters enormously. It reveals that by this stage, decisions about the monarch's own plate no longer originated from personal choice at all. They passed through layers of institutional oversight designed to protect not simply her well-being, but the stability of the crown itself. This marks the beginning of the uppermost tier, where dining rules cease to be about image and become instruments of structural authority. The 12th card, connected to a formal engagement scheduled during a period of recovery from illness, documents an unusual absence, a course quietly removed without public explanation. Household records suggest this was a deliberate act of concealment designed to prevent any outward sign that might invite speculation about the Queen's condition. In an institution where uncertainty about succession or capacity could ripple into constitutional questions, even a missing course on a menu card became a tool for managing public perception of continuity. Here, the logic of enforcement changes entirely. It is no longer the master of the household alone who holds authority, nor even the private secretary. Decisions of this magnitude involved the palace communications office, medical advisors, and in some instances, discreet consultation with government officials responsible for constitutional contingency planning. The stakes were no longer reputational. They touched directly on the perceived stability of the monarchy as a functioning institution, a concern far graver than any single dinner or diplomatic slight. The 13th card offers perhaps the clearest illustration of this principle. Prepared for a Commonwealth gathering late in her reign, it shows a menu stripped of any dish associated with excess or extravagance, replaced instead with something almost austere in its simplicity. Historians examining the palace archives have noted that this shift coincided with a broader institutional effort to present the monarchy as disciplined and enduring at a moment when public debate about the relevance of the crown was intensifying. The meal itself became a quiet argument for the institution's continued legitimacy, evidence offered not through speeches, but through restraint made visible on a printed card. The 14th card touches on something rarely discussed outside palace circles, the question of who is permitted to alter a royal menu once it has received final approval. Records show that on this occasion, a senior chef attempted a last-minute change, a minor addition intended purely as a gesture of culinary pride. The change was reversed within hours, not by Elizabeth herself, but by household administration acting on standing protocol that granted no individual, regardless of skill or intention, the authority to deviate from an approved menu without formal clearance. This reveals a structural truth about the monarchy that extends well beyond food. Authority within the institution rarely rests with a single person, not even the sovereign. It rests within a system of checks, precedents, and formalized permissions designed to prevent any one figure, however senior, from unilaterally altering established order. This brings the collection to its 15th and final card, the one that carries the greatest institutional significance of all. Dated from one of Elizabeth's last official engagements, the menu shows an instruction that departs from nearly 7 decades of precedent. For the first time in the archive, a note appears indicating that future menu decisions for major state functions would require joint approval from both the reigning monarch's household and the office of the heir apparent. On its surface, this appears to be a minor administrative adjustment. In reality, it represents something far more consequential, a formal acknowledgement that power within the institution was beginning to transfer before the moment of succession itself arrived. The rule governing something as small as a state banquet menu had quietly become a mechanism for managing the transition of monarchical authority, ensuring continuity not through ceremony, but through structural foresight embedded years in advance. Taken together, these 15 menu cards form far more than a record of culinary preference. They trace the architecture of an institution that understood, long before the public did, that even the smallest details carried the weight of governance. What began with a simple grilled sole in the 1950s ends with a formal restructuring of authority itself, communicated not through parliamentary announcement or royal decree, but through the quiet language of an approved dinner menu. Elizabeth's relationship with food, then, was never truly personal in the way most understand the term. It existed within a framework built to protect the monarchy from every possible vulnerability, whether ceremonial, diplomatic, medical, or constitutional. Her preferences, where they existed at all, were filtered through decades of institutional caution, shaped by advisors whose task was never to please the monarch, but to preserve the crown. What these documents ultimately reveal is not a portrait of appetite, but a portrait of power, one where every rule, no matter how minor it appeared, served a larger structural purpose. The monarchy did not simply survive 7 decades of change by chance. It survived because even its smallest details, down to a single line on a menu card, were treated as instruments of control, discipline, and continuity, ensuring that the institution itself would always outlast the individual who for a time sat at its head.